I want to just read to you a piece of the summary of Perek Gimel, and then I'm going to select a couple subjects from the rest of Yevamot that are important, but I think we've done enough of the four brothers and three sisters who are related and one isn't. You want to do more of that. I'm sure there are many people who would be happy to teach you, but I think we've done enough of that. I just want to read a little bit of Steinsaltz's summary of Perek Gimel, in which he states the general halakhic conclusion is the levirate bond is substantial, and it begins at the moment of the husband's death. The bond created is of a unique nature, at once similar in effect to the bond of betrothal, yet with clear differences. Due to its unique status, the levirate bond can exist between one woman and several brothers-in-law at once, and need not be limited to one single brother-in-law. The problems that arise from the combinations of possible situations involving different relatives led to a wider discussion in this chapter. To what extent might a prohibition take effect where another prohibition already exists? All of the opinions were clarified, from those that maintain that prohibitions do take effect where others already exist, to those that propose that they can take effect only under special circumstances. For example, when there are more inclusive prohibitions, expanded prohibitions, or simultaneous prohibitions. This chapter also discussed halachic rulings involving uncertainties. For example, the status of a woman who happens before a yavam is unclear because her betrothal or her divorce is in doubt. In such cases, it was determined that the woman, sometimes two women, require chalitza in order to resolve the situation. As typical of Steinsaltz, he really provides a wonderful overview. I want to read just a very brief piece of his introduction to the fourth chapter, and we'll study one of the Mishnayot in this chapter, and then we'll go on to other chapters where there are other interesting things, but we're going to kind of stop this business of four brothers and three sisters and this complicated stuff. Chapter 4 begins with a consideration of cases in which there was no requirement to perform yibum or chalitza, but nevertheless, they performed it. For example, if they were performed with a pregnant woman who later gave birth to a viable offspring. When chalitza is performed in such cases, the question arises of how to relate to it. Does such an act of chalitza have any significance? In other words, more complicated, they shouldn't. It's not required, but they do. And a child is born. Again, we've we saw this very briefly, but they go into this. Who is the father? Is the father the brother who died and the woman was pregnant before his death? Or is the father the new brother who married,
if she did chalitza, it wouldn't be the new brother, but then she wouldn't be able to marry a Kohen because she would be divorced. No,
that's correct. She wouldn't, she would not be married. It doesn't, the Torah doesn't explicitly prohibit a Kohen from marrying a woman who had chalitza, but the halacha includes such a woman. It's not explicit in the Torah. But in this case, they shouldn't have yibum and chalit. Yibum was not required. Yet the couple, the brother-in-law, did sleep with his sister-in-law. And she got pregnant, and then we have problems. All right. A second case, if the Yavam, that is the brother-in-law, with the widow had sexual relationships under the assumption that this would be Yibum, this is very serious. This is because in cases where there is no requirement of Yibum, the two are prohibited from having sex by an explicit prohibition. The Gemara discusses their liability and further considers the status of a child that might be born from such a sexual relation. Is that child a mamzer? That's what we're going to look. We're not going to look at that particular thing, but we're going to look at what is a mamzer. In many cases, if a child is born several months after sex, there could be uncertainty whether the father was the original brother or his brother, the Yavam. And therefore, there's some possibility that it could be a mamzer. And these issues are discussed in the Talmud in detail. Thank God we won't. Okay, one more. Another central issue is the relationship between the brother-in-law, the surviving brother, and the widow before any action is taken. When there is only a bond, remember that root, Zayin Kuf Kuf, there is a zikah. This is established, this bond, as soon as the brother dies. In such cases, what rights does the brother-in-law, the surviving brother, have over the property of his sister-in-law, who is now a widow? And they then discuss different issues regarding the property. Again, we will not deal with this. However, at the end of the chapter, and this we will come to next time, it concludes with questions of slaves and conversion. And the source on this is the major, or certainly a major, if not the major, source for the laws of conversion, of Giur. So we'll look at that. But today, I wanted to study with you a Mishnah which begins Ezehu Mamzer.
The shul president.
What did you say?
The shul president.
The shul president. Well, yeah, that's the joke, right? That in Eastern Europe, the rabbi explains to the parents that the child is a mamzer, and there is no way out of it. Not only is he a mamzer, but this condition, this status remains forever. And the children and the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and everybody else will be mamzerim. So the couple is very, very upset. And they say, Rabbi, isn't there something that can be done? And the rabbi says, don't worry. Your grandson will move to America and he'll become the president of a synagogue. That's the joke that Steve is referring to. It's not so, by the way. Not every shul president is a mamzer. Okay. Okay, so the Mishnah begins, Mishnah 13 in chapter 4, begins with the question, what is a mamzer? And we have a dispute. The first opinion is that of Rabbi Akiva, and it is the offspring of a union with any next of kin that is subject to a Torah prohibition that they should not engage in sexual relations. The Hebrew, kol she'er basar, shehu v'lo yavo. This, of course, is a quote from the Torah. Any relative, any person who shares who shares parentage, who shares some relationship, related to them, they're related to each other, and they are, and the Torah says they are not permitted to have sexual relations. That's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. But Shimon Hatimni, says our text, interesting, in the Yeshua, my commentary here of Pinchas Kahati, he vocalizes it. Shimon HaTeimani. Teiman, of course, is the Hebrew word for Yemen. And one of the significant advantages of the Mishnah edition, contemporary Mishnah edition of Albeck. Albeck is the commentator, but Hanoch Albeck, but the vocalization was done by someone else. His name was Hanoch Yalom. And the vocalization of the Albeck Mishnah is based on oral recitation of the Mishnah by Yemenite and other Mizrahi communities, and in here he does vocalize it as Shimon HaTeimani.
Doesn't that just mean that he's from the east? Because they used to say Negba was south and Teimana is east, right? And Yama is west.
Yama's west. I don't know. Let me just see if Steinsaltz has anything. No, I don't see anything. Wait a minute. P personnel. Okay, here we have it. Steinsaltz writes, Shimon, he calls him Hatimni, was a Tana during the generation of Rabbi Akiva, whose title is derived from his home city of Timnah in Judea. He was one of the important sages of the Sanhedrin in Yavne. He numbers among those few sages who understood 70 languages. However, due to his young age, he was never ordained, so he is not Rabbi. Instead, he is referred to as one who deliberated before the rabbis. Despite his young age, and even though he was connected to the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, he was nevertheless not his preeminent disciple. In fact, occasionally, as here, he disputed with Rabbi Akiva. Most of the statements quoted in the Mishnah and Braitot in his name involves matters of halacha. He seldom is quoted with regard to Agadah. Of course, these two terms, I want to make sure you know, we've been studying only Mishnah, which almost in its entirety is only halacha. Agadah is everything that comes from the rabbis that isn't halacha. So that includes legends, that includes moral teachings, that includes everything other than legal matters. We have obviously many collections of Agadah in collections of Midrash. So most of the Midrash really is Agadah, even in those collections of Midrash, which are typically called Midrashei Halacha. These are the collections of Midrash that come from the Mishnaic times. Like, for instance, Mechilta, which is a collection of Midrash on Exodus, or Sifra, which is a collection of Midrash on Leviticus, or Sifrei, which is collection of Midrash on Bamidbar and Devarim. These are known as halachic Midrash because they come from the time of the Mishnah, but they mainly have Agadah in them. Later Midrashim also have collections of Midrashim. We have only one Mishnah, the Mishnah. That's what we're studying. But there is not one midrash. There are many collections of midrash, the most famous being Midrash Rabbah. Regrettably, in my opinion, when the Sansino translation of Midrash Rabbah came out, they called it the Midrash, which really is confusing. It's only those collections that are called Rabbah, so Bereshit Rabbah, or Shmot Rabbah, or Vayikra Rabbah. These are later collections, but we have even later ones, like, for instance, Midrash Yelamdeinu, or Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. We have lots and lots of collections of Midrash. There is no book called the Midrash. There are many, many collections. Some of them go based, I like to say there are basically two, what's the plural of Zitz and Laban? Zitz? There are two places where Midrash was created. One was in the Beit Midrash, in the process of studying, that a verse was studied and it was interpreted. It was expanded upon. That's Midrash. It was the rabbinic explanation that was passed on from generation to generation. The other source of Midrash was in sermons or teachings that were given, usually not by rabbis, but by magidim, by itinerant preachers who would go around from community to community and would talk about the week's portion. In many of them, there's a whole collection of midrashim that came from such a source, but they always begin with a passage from the writings. And they often also quote a passage from the prophets. And then they go into the Torah portion. You know that in the synagogue, we read from the Torah, and every week we also read a passage from the prophets. In ancient times, there was also a practice of reading a passage from the writings, from the Ketubim. And so the theory is that the Magid, the person who was giving this teaching, would quote something from that reading from the writings first, then would also quote from the Haftorah, ending up with a much longer comment, story, elaboration of the Torah portion. So there was a common structure, which of course, since we do not read any passage from the writings regularly on Shabbat, and also in the land of Israel, their Torah portions were smaller than those in Babylonia. it took them 3+ years to go from Genesis all the way to Deuteronomy. They had smaller portions. So these midrashim that came from the land of Israel relate to these smaller portions. And they each had a haftarah and a reading from the writings, from the Ketuvim. The Babylonian practice was to complete the Torah in 1 year, which of course is our practice. But the midrash that came from the land of Israel came from a place where the Torah portions were smaller and shorter. That's also something that has to be taken into account. We do not have, other than in these midrashim, any record, at least to my knowledge, of what passages were read. Obviously, there were more haftarot, more prophetic passages, and there were passages from the writings for each week. Any questions? Yes, and Elson.
Well, a couple of things. One, though we read the Torah every year, we only read a third of the passages, and we have the same haftarah year after year. There aren't 3 separate haftarahs.
This is a new innovation. When I was growing up, we did not have the triennial cycle. We read the whole Torah portion. There was a decision made, I would guess about 40 years ago, that the service on Shabbat morning was long, and to give, and in the contemporary world, the knowledge of most people in the congregation is not sufficient to really understand the Hebrew that is being read from the Torah. So to allow time for the rabbi to teach the message of that Torah portion, we will read only a third of it and allow time for the rabbi to explain in English what the Torah portion is all about. The triennial cycle that the conservative movement adopted is entirely different from the ancient triennial cycle. The ancient triennial cycle read it consecutively, which makes sense. They were reading just smaller portions, but it was consecutive. What we're doing now in most conservative congregations, though not all, is 1 year we read the first third of each portion. The next year we read the middle third, and the next year we read the third third. And as you are correct, in most conservative congregations, they read the same haftorah each year, no matter whether it's the first third, second third, or third third. There was a proposal, and I don't know of any congregation that adopted it, but there was a proposal, since we don't read all of the prophets, that we create new haftarot for the triennial cycle, so that one year we'll read a haftarah, but the next year we'll read something else that the ancients did not choose as a haftarah. The haftarot represent only a tiny percentage of what is in the prophets. As far as I know, no congregation adopted that, but it was proposed. Yes,
Shana
Steve.
Tova. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova to you. Great
Everyone
to
have
see
a good
you.
year, good healthy year. We'll see you on the other side of Rosh Hashanah.
God bless you. Best
Okay.
regards.
Bye-bye. Likewise.
Bye.
I have a follow-up question.
Yes, Nelson.
If the rabbi gives you said that at last week, that at one time the rabbi only gave a sermon twice a year.
Correct.
But if he now gives a sermon every week, isn't that a source of new midrash?
Absolutely. I would argue that not every sermon, it depends what the rabbi does. But if the rabbi does a traditional sermon, which is taking the Torah portion and interpreting it in a way that it applies to our life today, that, as far as I'm concerned, is midrash. So we are creating midrash, contemporary midrash. But that's not if the rabbi's talking about Israel or talking about anti-Semitism or the latest movie or the latest book or whatever. That's something else. But if it's a traditional sermon which interprets the Torah portion to apply to our life today, yes, that is midrash.
What if the interprets the Torah portion to apply to the latest book? Or crisis in Israel? Or...
Yeah, that could be midrash. But see, midrash has to begin with a pasuk. It has to grow out of the text. And if it doesn't grow out of it can go anywhere. But it's got to grow out of the text. Yes, Karen.
So we read the whole thing every week, and it really doesn't take that long, just as a comment. But also the rabbi, when he does the sermon, always only picks one little part of the Torah portion and talks about that. So I guess in that way he's doing, I've never kept track year after year if he does. I think it's whatever, hits him the week when he's writing the sermon. But I don't know. So
yeah, no, I think the practice in your congregation is much more traditional. The shorter portions, one of the advantages of the triennial cycle is that the readings are usually much shorter, and therefore it's much for people who are not as fluent as some of the people who I grew up with, who could handle the whole Torah portion and next week too. So many more people can learn and can read the Torah in the congregation, because if you have to learn a long portion, that's quite a task, and the many of the aliyot are quite long, and to learn to chant it, since, as you know, in the Torah scroll there's no vowels, there's no punctuation, and there's no indication of how it should be delivered in terms of the trope. And so if you're going to do it and do these long portions, either, well, you have to be quite knowledgeable and quite talented to read these long portions.
So,
Yes, Karen.
so the young man that mostly reads Torah for us has a tikkun up there. And when somebody's, when you're doing the prayers before and after, you can see him over to the side with his finger on the tikkun.
Just double checking to make sure he's.
Yeah.
It's for most of us, it's quite a task. So I think that the shorter portions, while I recognize that we lose a lot because you take a little piece of this week's portion, but what about the rest of it? Oh, next year. It's not the way it's supposed to be. But I would suggest, however, that the smaller portions does have a positive result in that more people can learn to read and can that way participate more in the service. One of my pet peeves is that we have in the non-Orthodox communities assumed that the service is like a Christian service. And that's not Jewish. The rabbi, I've said this before, you don't need a rabbi for a service. The rabbi has no function in a service other than as one of the 10 people required for a service. You don't need the rabbi to announce pages, to tell you when to stand and when to sit. People should know that. And you don't need a cantor. You just need somebody who can chant the service and can keep the people more or less together and can say those things like the Baruch Hu and the Kedusha that are required for a minyan and can lead the congregation. But the Jewish practice is that everybody prays for themselves. We're not an audience listening to the cantor and the rabbi. We're participants. We are not a passive audience. And one of the terrible things that has happened is that we've adopted the architecture of the Protestant church, turned the cantor around to face us, so we think he is entertaining us like at a concert or an opera or something. And the rabbi also is, instead of just being one of the people praying, is up there telling us what page we're on and when to stand and when to sit. I call the contemporary rabbi a page boy. Traditionally, you don't need a page boy. And one of my pet peeves, I've said it before, is that our kids who go to Schechter and who go to Camp Ramah and know the service as well as the rabbi do not need the rabbi to tell them what page they're on. They know very well what page they're on because all summer they've been davening. And if they go to Schechter, they're knowledgeable. They don't need it. But what has happened in most conservative congregations is that it's still modeled after the assumption that the congregation is completely ignorant and the rabbi is the only one who knows what page they're on. So he's got to tell them. It's a shame. Okay. I said enough. Shimon HaTeimani Omer Kol Shechayavin Alav Karet Bidei Shamayim. So he's disagreeing with Rabbi Akiva's definition of who a mamzer is. Rabbi Akiva says, referring to the passage from Leviticus, where we read, and in fact, that's the reading for Yom Kippur in the Mincha service, the laws of incest. He quotes that. That is any child born of such a relationship is a mamzer. Shimon HaTeimani says he disagrees. Anyone who is the result of a relationship in which the punishment for the parents was karet bidei shamayim. Karet means to be cut off. This is the punishment that God provides of a premature death. Karet bidei shamayim. Karet is always bidei shamayim. That is, karet is not a punishment given by a court, but rather a punishment given by God. Lichrot is to cut off, like for instance, you cut off a branch from a tree. It also is the root for making a covenant, lichrot brit. And that probably because, as you know, when God makes a covenant with Abraham, there's a kind of a splitting, one side and one side. A covenant has a splitting, both sides come together. The Mishnah continues to say, halacha kidvarav. The halacha goes according to him. In other words, the halacha is not according to Rabbi Akiva, but rather according to Shimon HaTeimani. We have a third opinion.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So if I remember correctly, like a thief who steals something in the night so that no one sees him, he's karet b'shamayim. So his child would be a mamzer?
No, he
would be.
That's his punishment.
But it goes down through the generations.
No.
No? Okay.
No. The punishment of karet is there are a number of mitzvot for which the punishment is karet. Not a human punishment, but God punishes you. In this case, what the Mishnah is saying is that if the couple the relationship, the sexual relationship that they had was punishable by karet, the child born of such a relationship is a mamzer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Rabbi Joshua has a third opinion. Kol shechayavim alav mitat beit din. This is now anyone who is, here's chayavin, chayavim. Interesting. The nun suffix is really the Aramaic. And the Mishnah has sometimes the influence of Aramaic. So sometimes you see the suffix of the masculine plural being a nun, but most of the time it's a mem. It's obviously the same thing. Interesting here, we have one after the other, nun one and mem the other. This is a different punishment. This one is the punishment of a human court. This is a capital offense. A court-imposed capital punishment. Now, the Mishnah continues in a very interesting way. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai said, Matzati Megillat Yuchasin Birushalayim. I found a text in Jerusalem, a scroll, Megillah, a scroll of Yuchasin, Yichus, relationships, a genealogical scroll in Jerusalem. And in it was written, Ish Ploni, John Doe. Ish Ploni is the equivalent of John Doe. In other words, somebody, we're not giving his name, is a mamzer me eshet ish. He's the product of an adulterous relationship. And Rabbi Shimon ben Azai quoted this, and the Mishnah says the only reason for the scroll to state the reason that this individual is a mamzer is in order to support the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua. The punishment for adultery is mitat beit din, is a capital punishment, not by God, by a court. This concludes this particular section of this Mishnah. We have here the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, quoting the Torah portion, anybody for whom it is stated explicitly in the Torah. Shimon ben Teimani says, no, it's broader than that. Anybody who has a relationship for which the punishment is karet, that is God's killing that person early. And the Mishnah adds, and the law follows him. But then we have Rabbi Joshua saying no, it's anyone who is liable for a court-based capital punishment. Then we have the story brought of Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, who says that he found a text giving the genealogy of a family, and it mentions somebody who is a mamzer of an adulterous relationship, the punishment of which is mitat beit din, and the Mishnah says this is in order to prove Rabbi Joshua's opinion, which of course would not agree with the Mishnah saying the law goes according to Shimon HaTeimani. Questions? We're going to come back to this, but I would like to, if we can, finish this Mishnah, and then we'll come back to discuss this first part and to see how the tradition handles this dispute, where we seem to have three opinions, one of which the Mishnah says is the halacha, but another one for which Rabbi Shimon ben Azai has some physical proof of another opinion. Let's
Rabbi?
just finish this, and then we'll come back to that next week. If his wife died, if a man's wife died, he can then marry her sister. Because she's died, that relationship is no longer in existence. The sister died. It's no longer her sister alive, because if a man's wife dies, he's permitted to her sister. If a man divorces his wife and then she dies, again, he's permitted to the woman's sister. It's crucial here, not the divorce, but the death. If the woman, after a divorce, marries someone else and she then dies, and again, that's the crucial element here, again, the man can marry her sister. If his sister-in-law died and he is obligated to marry her through the levirate relationship, if she dies, it's no longer his sister-in-law. She can marry her sister. If they did chalitza and she died, again, he can marry her sister. So this Mishnah, interesting, continues with an entirely different subject. But the crucial point here is, once a woman's sister dies, then the relationship, the sibling relationship, no longer exists, and the husband can marry her. Any questions on that? Okay, so next time we're going to come back just briefly to this and I'll go into how the Gemara handles this and how the tradition handles it. And then we're going to go on to later on in this chapter, laws dealing with, excuse me, not in this chapter, in the next, well, we're going on to the laws of conversion, which is very, very important. And and this is really the classical source for these laws. Have a Shana Tova. May I hope your prayers are meaningful, and that you celebrate in an appropriate way, and that you should have a Shana Tova, a healthy, a good year, and a sweet year. Sweet I'm sure that traditionally children were taught the alphabet by sweets. That is, the aleph would be written on a paper, and it would be written with candy. And the child would trace the alphabet and then be able to lick his finger and have the candy. The study of Torah is to give us a sense of sweetness, a sense of joy, of celebration. Eitz Chaim Hi, it is a tree of life, and it is a source, God willing, of joy and of happiness. It's not a burden. I think I may have told you, I'm trying to remember. It was when I was teaching at the University of Virginia, I had a wonderful colleague by the name of Walter Nebel. And he was a Protestant minister, but his field was Indian religion. And he got his PhD from Harvard, and he came to the University of Virginia when I did, and we kind of broadened the religion department from basically a Protestant department. I taught Judaism and then taught Islam after my first year. He taught Indian religions, and he also taught an introduction to world religions. And it was the second day, I think, of a holiday, and the holiday was during the week. And so, of course, I wasn't teaching. It was a lovely day. I think it was Pesach. And I'm sitting outside with our little daughter at the time, and I'm reading a book in the sun, and he is carrying two big briefcases. Indian religious texts are like the traditional Talmud. They're gigantic and very heavy. So he's got two heavy briefcases, and he says to me, as he walks by me, there he is, suffering under the burden of the law. He understood Judaism. And in fact, when David Harnett, who was the chairman of the department, was recruiting him to come to the University of Virginia, he said he refused to come unless they taught Judaism. He said there's no way he can teach Indian religions if the only thing kids know is Christianity. So when I was being recruited, the chairman said, we've got to have you come because we can't get the professor of Indian religions unless you come too. And we want both of you. So it's not only you do we want, but we want him too. And there's no way we're going to get him unless you come. So anyhow, the halacha is not a burden to a Jew. And study of Torah is not a burden. It's a joy. And that's why certain times we're not allowed to study Torah, because we're supposed to be sad. It's not a force of sadness, nor it is a burden. It is a joy and fulfillment. God bless you. See you next week in Yirtzeh Hashem. Bye-bye.